Sega Sega Guayo, Miranda Youngats. Hi, everyone. My name is Miranda Black, and I am the project manager at Water Allies. This evening, we're going to be talking about Great Lakes water health with Michelle Woodhouse, who is the manager of Great Lakes water protection at Environmental Defense, and then also Deb McGregor, who is an academic with York University, and is also the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice. She also has held so many job positions within the government surrounding water health and also Indigenous justice. I'm so grateful to have these folks here this evening, and we'll get started with introductions. Michelle, would you like to introduce yourself? Oh, you're on mute.
I just realized that. Classic. Yes, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Michelle Woodhouse. I'm based here in Toronto, Takaranto, and I grew up in Southern Ontario. I'm Métis and I'm English Canadian, and my Métis side of the family is originally from Lac Saint Anne, Manitou Sakakigan, which means spirit of the lake, in Cree, which is out west in so-called Alberta. And I personally have felt a really strong connection to water since a really young age. But it wasn't until I was in my 20s when I really decided to pursue a life that was dedicated to water protections. And during this time, I started to engage in grassroots water protection, climate justice, and the fight for Indigenous rights, and to respect the sovereignty and self-determination of Indigenous peoples. And I also pursued my undergraduate in environmental studies and environmental geography at U of T on St. George campus. And I then went on to pursue my master's in environmental science and management at Toronto Metropolitan University, where I focused on freshwater governance in the Great Lakes. And I worked as a student intern for the Great Lakes Policy Research Network and the Canadian Environmental Law Association on Great Lakes governance issues before I came to Environmental Defense Canada. And I now work in Environmental Defense Canada as the program manager of freshwater protections and the Great Lakes. And I'm also a vocal advocate for things like land back and land being returned to Indigenous peoples, and the need for us to take the lead from Indigenous peoples when it comes to addressing the many intersecting ecological crises that we're experiencing as a species, which we'll touch on tonight. But some of these include the biodiversity crisis, the freshwater crisis, and the climate crisis. And all of these crises are caused by the same root issues that are stemming from the dominance of settler colonial extractive economies and systems of infinite growth that are prioritizing profit over life and prioritizing profit over water. I'll leave it there for now and pass it over to Deb.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm kind of wondering why our paths never crossed, but maybe they did. But anyway,
I did say I was a university fangirl of you, Deborah.
Okay. So amazing work that you're doing. Deb McGregor, and right now I'm actually in my community, Whitefish River, and if it were still daylight out, I'd be looking out at Lake Huron, I guess, Georgian Bay, McGregor Bay, Lake Huron, so right on the Great Lakes, about 50 meters away. So happy about that. I won't repeat the introduction, but I will talk about what some of my involvement has been in Great Lakes, other than living by the Great Lakes and having grown up having to go get water down at the Great Lakes and relying on the fish for food in Great Lakes. But I think what I will say about that is, because it relates to governance and some of the other work that I do as part of this brief introduction, is just a lot of things that happened that wasn't communicated with First Nations. I do remember growing up and we were told not to eat the fish in the Great Lakes. This would have been the 70s when it was very contaminated. You could only have, especially if you're a woman of childbearing age, only fish 3 times a week of a certain size kind of thing. I do remember that, but no reasons why. We were still drinking the water, the very same water the fish were in, but you couldn't eat the fish. but when you're from a really poor community, that's kind of a big deal because you relied on fish like every day. So people just generally ignored that because the fish consumption guidelines didn't really accommodate the reality of First Nation communities and the relationship with or the reliance on fisheries and anything else that's coming from the water, including medicines. So I just thought I would mention that because there's gross lack of communication, not even any consideration that First Nations might have some distinct considerations as a result of treaties or self-determination or anything. The other was just because I'm recently involved in a project around the lamprey eels in the Great Lakes, is the spraying to control the lamprey eels would be taking place like without any, again, consultation or engagement with First Nations. People would be swimming where the poison basically is being released into the rivers to put the lamprey eel larvae, so they grow, because it was a threat to the fisheries. So just this really grotesque lack of engagement with First Nations, which now I guess we would call environmental justice. So there was this sort of like that lived experience, but in terms of professional, for over 25 years, I still continue to work at Chiefs of Ontario on Great Lakes issues, a lot of that advancing, engagement, involvement with Indigenous peoples. And I think it's taken a really long time, but finally, let's say the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement does recognize finally tribes and First Nations and Métis, because not very many Inuit around the Great Lakes. So that took a very long time. Recognition of traditional knowledge in the Great Lakes. So that's a lot of that sort of advocacy work that occurred over all that time. There's a lot more I can say about it in the Q&A in terms of all the experiences, in terms of understanding Great Lakes health and different initiatives over time. The other thing I'll say is part of it was, so I'm working with Chiefs of Ontario directly with First Nations. So they're a coordinating body for 133 First Nations in Ontario. Is also work I did with Environment Canada, now called Environment Canada and Climate Change. I worked in the Great Lakes office for 10 years. And again, so that advocacy was internal. So people would come, running into my office saying, we want to include traditional knowledge, but we don't know what it is. With the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, how does this work with science, right? Because that's what it says, they're supposed to work together. So having to really push from that point of view and also from the program point of view, so people knew they should be working with First Nations, not as some group that can contribute to a program, but actually their nations and governments and societies, and that's how you should be relating to Indigenous peoples, not as interests or stakeholders around the Great Lakes. So there's a lot to say there and a lot to draw on. So looking forward to the questions and the commentary. So I'll stop there. I've written many reports on Great Lakes stuff over the years. Pull it out of the filing cabinet of my brain to relay all the insane things that have happened over time.
Just to say, when Deb decided to join us for this conversation, I wrote back to the rest of the participants, I can't believe we got Deborah McGregor to come to our conversation. I'm so excited. But also, you're probably noticing that we are missing one participant, like one panelist this evening, Danielle Boissonneau, who was unable to make it due to some personal issues. However, we do send care and love to Danielle to get better. Maybe she's in the crowd tonight. And there's some great articles about Danielle's work online. I'll put some into the chat so that you can take a look at the amount of Great Lakes work that she's been doing. And hopefully next time we have a conversation like this, she's able to join us. Something else is that we are recording the conversation and we may be posting it on our Water Allies channel on YouTube. Other than that, I just want to recognize that I know that all of the participants who are in this crowd tonight are passionate about Great Lakes water health, but I just want to remind everyone to be respectful when using the chat, and we will have time for Q&A at the end of tonight's conversation. If you do have any questions during this time, please throw them into the chat box and we'll be able to get to your questions at the end of our conversation. So I'm just going to start tonight's conversation by asking Michelle, who is an expert in Great Lakes water health and management, just about the state of the Great Lakes generally. Michelle, could you explain what's happening in the Great Lakes? Or I know that's a huge question. These are massive water bodies, but just a quick overview.
Yeah, I'll try to give you as succinct an overview as I can. I'm essentially just going to kind of give you updates on the most recent State of the Great Lakes report that was released earlier in 2022, because those are always pretty good at really kind of just, giving a high level overview of how the Great Lakes are doing. So what the report in 2022 did tell us is that the Great Lakes are still a high quality source of drinking water, however, with the caveat of when properly treated, because we do know, as like Deborah's already mentioned, issues to do with fishing and drinking water. There's many Indigenous communities that don't have access to drinking water. There's also some rural communities in Ontario, non-Indigenous rural communities who are outside of what's called source protection zones that are relying on well water. And these communities often have to be careful about drinking that well water that could be contaminated. And the waters are generally safe for swimming, but we also do know that there's beaches that close, especially during the summer months if there's heavy rainfall due to bacterial contamination and pathogen risks, or even things like algae blooms, and can cause beaches to close. So that is an issue. And the Great Lakes fish, many fish can still be eaten if you're following safety consumption guidelines and advisories, but the unrestricted fish consumption is not possible. And this is having a greater impact on communities such as Indigenous communities that are relying on fish for food and cultural and spiritual and economic purposes. And we know that the Great Lakes have seen declines in things like chemicals such as PCBs and mercury overall, but we also know that there's concentrations of certain toxic chemicals such as PFAS, which are known as forever chemicals, and as well as things like microplastics and nanoplastics that are posing really significant threats to human health and the environment. And we're also seeing for Great Lakes wetlands, there's healthy coastal wetlands that exist in the basin, but the Great Lakes coastal wetlands are varying in quality, and the healthiest ones are in the northern locations where human activity and the human footprint is lower. And so there have been significant changes that have taken place in the food webs of the Great Lakes to varying degrees because of different stressors and things such as like invasive species and climate change are exacerbating this. We're also still seeing really high nutrient levels in parts of Lake Erie and other parts of the Great Lakes. And there's toxic cyanobacteria blooms that are happening in Lake Erie in the summer that are persistent and ongoing problem. Lake Erie is actually identified as it's in a poor state, and that's unchanging. Whereas some other lakes are either in like a fair or a good state, but Lake Erie is in a poor state. So that's definitely an issue. And, in non-native species, such invasive species such as Asian carp are still continuing to spread within and between the different lakes. And overall, we do have on groundwater, we have pretty good groundwater, but again, we're seeing things like chlorides from road salts and nitrates from fertilizers that are showing elevated levels of pollutants in certain parts of the groundwater in the Great Lakes. And lastly, I'll just say that we have things like population growth that's being accompanied by poor land use planning and habitat loss and degradation that's happening due to things like urban sprawl and intensive land use activities like mining and mega corporate agribusiness operations that are wreaking havoc. We have climate change impacts such as less ice cover and warming lakes that are impairing Great Lakes water quality. So really big issues for us to be concerned about. And I think I'll just end it off in saying that when it comes to the Great Lakes and freshwater protections, this has been historically and consistently underfunded in Canada. And the Great Lakes hold over 80% of North America's freshwater, but yet they do continue to take a back seat to other issues. We definitely are putting more money towards things like fossil fuel subsidies than we are towards protecting freshwater in Canada, despite having such an abundance of it here, and despite there being a growing freshwater crisis around the world. Even last year, we had an announcement after the federal election, there'd be $1 billion over 10 years that Canada would spend for its large lakes and rivers. That amount is nowhere near enough for all of Canada's large lakes and rivers. It's not even enough for the Great Lakes alone. And even after that announcement was made in the last budget, after it was made, the environmental minister decided to not include the funding because they were prioritizing other things such as climate change. So that's important, but it shouldn't come at the expense of protecting fresh water, given, you know, all of the things that I just mentioned are pretty significant issues that require significant attention and resources.
That's definitely a lot of information. And where would folks go to learn more about the Great Lakes and the strategy? Is there a chance that you might have a link that you could post later?
I can drop like just the link to the State of the Great Lakes report that folks can read through if they'd like to, because I do think that it does provide a pretty, it's pretty digestible when you go through it in terms of how it breaks things down and giving a high level. So I could definitely grab that link and get it in the chat.
Great. I know that you're very passionate about line 5 and line 3, and I'm wondering if you would be able to explain more about the issues that line 5 and line 3 may cause, but also why is it such a major threat to the Great Lakes? And also what's happening with, there's a lot of land defense movements happening in the United States for these, and what's happening there? So there's
Right.
2 to 3 questions in that one question.
No problem. So yeah, so I'll focus mostly on like line 5 because I work on in my work. So one of the things that I am working on that I didn't introduce in my intro is working alongside tribes in the US, as well as working alongside First Nations here who support the permanent closure of the Line 5 pipeline, which runs straight through the heart of the Great Lakes. And I work alongside as well as the settler allies who are working on this in the States and now in Canada. It's been mostly just me, but there's a few more who are starting to join the fight over on this side of the border. So just a bit of a rundown about the Line 5 pipeline for folks who have never really, may not have heard of it, or may have just very little information about it. It's essentially one of the largest threats to the Great Lakes is the Line 5 pipeline. There's a few factors for this. Line 5 was designed to operate for 50 years. It's now 70 years old, so it's 20 years past its design lifespan. It's been documented in a state of ill repair, and the pipeline's been compromised at multiple locations along the route, which I can talk a little bit more about. But essentially, this pipeline is an ecological disaster in the making that's crossing directly through the heart of the Great Lakes Basin, the largest freshwater body system in the world. And it cannot be overstated how essential the Great Lakes are to all life here. So numerous safety violations have already occurred. This pipeline's already leaked at least 33 times that have been documented. And some of those have been very, very significant. In total, there's about over at least 4.5 million liters of oil that's spilled into surrounding lands and waters since 1953 that we know of. And most of those leaks were not detected by Enbridge, who owns the pipeline. They were not detected by Enbridge's leak system. So Line 5, just in terms of where it's located and situated and the Great Lakes, it starts at the westernmost tip of Lake Superior in Superior, Wisconsin, and it takes a route that goes just south of the southern Lake Superior shoreline until it finally reaches the Straits of Mackinac, which folks who are not familiar with the Straits of Mackinac, it's an extremely important area in the Great Lakes. It really is like the heart of the Great Lakes. It connects Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. And I mean, Lake Superior is just above it. Like it's kind of like the nexus point of those three different lakes. And also just in terms of the significance, and I'm sure Deborah can speak to some of this as well, because Manitoulin Island is not too far down the way from the Straits of Mackinac. You've got Mackinac Island, you have an all of the islands that are just all part of one system, Mackinac Island's there. And eventually you get to Manitoulin Island, and it's a very important part of the Great Lakes. While doing this work, things that I have learned in terms of the significance of the area is, for example, the word Mackinac itself is a derivative of an Anishinaabe-Moan word that means turtle. And Mackinac Island's original name is Michilimackinac, which means Mackinac Island. And it's also a very significant place. As some of you may know, that some Indigenous peoples from this part of the world do refer to North America as Turtle Island. And for the Anishinaabe, who've been here for well over 10,000 years, the Straits of Mackinac are the epicenter of where the creation story takes place of Turtle Island. There was tribal warriors who would pray to Gichimanatu, to Creator on Mackinac Island. There's ancient tribal burial grounds in the Straits of Mackinac area. There's an ancient river that's over 10,000 years old. There's been recently ancient artifacts discovered in the area. And on top of it being such an ecologically important and significant area of the Great Lakes, the currents in the Straits of Mackinac sometimes are 10 times the strength of Niagara Falls. And I'm going to tell you people a stat just to put into context how horrifically scary line 5 being in the Straits of Mackinac and the Great Lakes is. So if line 5 were to leak into the Straits of Mackinac, in a best case scenario, Enbridge would be able to shut this pipeline off in 13.5 minutes. So, and that's like that's absolutely best case scenario. They find out about things right away, they make really fast decisions, and they shut it off. And in that time, over 1 million liters of crude oil, so it's light crude oil, but it's still some of the dirtiest tar sands oil out there. Extremely complicated to clean up, and over 1 million liters could be released into the Straits in just over 13 minutes. So this would engulf the shorelines of Lake Michigan, Lake Huron. It would devastate the Great Lakes, and it's unlikely Enbridge would even react that quickly, because we do know it took Enbridge about 17 hours to shut off the Line 6B spill that happened into the Kalamazoo River. And for folks who aren't familiar with that spill, that was one of the largest inland spills that has happened in North American history, that a decade later, some of these medicines that Deborah's already referenced that are so essential to Anishinaabe culture and way of life still have not recovered. The area has not recovered. Families were displaced. Over 200 families were displaced. Some people died. It was a horrific accident. So as Enbridge took 17 hours to shut that, not accident, it was a horrific event to happen, because it could have been prevented, I think. And it took Enbridge 17 hours, as I said, to shut this off. So imagine what could happen if over 1 million liters can leak in 13 minutes. And if this happened in the wintertime when there's ice cover, that would complicate cleanup strategies even more with these really strong currents. It's just today, this pipeline would never, ever be approved. It would never be approved for this area. So that's kind of a few of the really big, from a high level, why this is such a threat, just from a safety perspective. And I'll talk a bit about actually another area, so the Straits of Mackinac is a very problematic area for this pipeline to cross. And there's currently, because of before I jump to another point actually. In terms of what's going on in Michigan and the threat Line 5 poses to the Great Lakes because of where it's running through in the Straits of Mackinac, there's been a mandated shutdown order from the Michigan governor that came after years of advocacy from basically Indigenous-led advocacy and calls to shut down the pipeline that were joined by allies in these calls. And eventually they had a governor who knew enough about, like, when she was shown the modeling and told all of this information, she knew enough to know this was a problem and that it should be shut down. And so now Enbridge is fighting this in court, of course, and they're arguing that they'll build a tunnel through the Straits of Mackinac, and this to address the threat that the pipeline poses specifically there. But I mean, this tunnel is very, very problematic. It would take 5 to 10 years to build. It would potentially desecrate through ancient Anishinaabe artifacts and burial grounds. It will cause further damage to the ecosystem as well. Experts have already flagged this. There's things like the risk of explosion due to methane gas in that area that could be a problem. There's issues to do with the engineering feasibility of the tunnel that experts have flagged. And not only that, but the tunnel, it will leave plenty of opportunities for the pipeline for Line 5 to leak elsewhere, because the Straits of Mackinac are only one part of this very dangerous pipeline that is a threat along its entire route. But because of the factors to do with the Straits of Mackinac, this is part of the reason why Line 5, compared to other pipelines in the Great Lakes Basin, is particularly problematic, and why we want it to be the first one to go and to be shut down as we're decommissioning and phasing out fossil fuels and pipelines in the decade to come. So I'll jump now to what's going on in another case right now. And oh, sorry, I forgot to mention with the Michigan case, Bay Mills Indian community, whose traditional territories and waters are right at the Straits of Mackinac, are an intervening party in the court case. And there's a few other tribes that are also intervening parties in the court case that Michigan has. And so jumping to what's going on in Wisconsin, there's another tribe, an Anishinaabe tribe, Bad River Band, where Line 5 crosses through their territory. And Bad River Band has called for Enbridge to be evicted from their territory. They want the pipeline to be removed completely and shut down immediately. They've been for years flagging issues with the pipeline on their territory. And for example, the pipeline was found exposed, about almost 50 feet of it was exposed, and about 10 to 15 feet were completely unsupported on the tribe's territory, because the Bad River has a natural meander that happens, and because of natural processes of erosion, there's erosion that's happening, and this is causing the pipeline to become more exposed where it crosses through the meander. And things like climate change and increased rainfall are only going to make the threat of a rupture from Line 5 to happen on Bad River Band's territory to occur. And if that were to happen, Bad River is a tributary to Lake Superior, so that would devastate and cause catastrophic impacts to Lake Superior as well. And in fact, in the Bad River, so there's a court case that Bad River Band has against Enbridge, and that case actually just wrapped up, and there's been a few there's been an interim judgment so far, but a final judgment hasn't been made. But what we do know is that the judge of that case did in fact find Enbridge guilty of trespassing on Bad River Band's territory, and that Bad River Band is within their power to evict them. And the judge also did agree and found that there is significant reason to be concerned about a rupture happening, and that it would cause, in the judge's words, catastrophic impacts to Lake Superior. But with that said, the outcome of that is yet to be determined, because Enbridge, first of all, Enbridge has been arguing to not even have to leave. They just like in the Straits of Mackinac example, they just want to keep operating the pipeline. Many people don't even fully believe that they're serious about building the tunnel and that it's just a way to delay the operation of the pipeline. And same with this reroute. Many people don't believe that this reroute around Bad River Band's territory that they're proposing to do in Wisconsin, because of being evicted from the territory, Enbridge doesn't actually want to do this. They want to keep the pipeline operating as is, but they may be forced to do something like a reroute, which also comes with its own set of problems. So we're just awaiting to see kind of what the other judgments on that will be. And there's also with the Michigan case, a few things like that case is still ongoing. So we're waiting to see what's going to come out of that. And then there's also permitting things that Enbridge would have to obtain from the state level in both Michigan and in Wisconsin, as well as at the federal level, like environmental impact statements for like this tunnel and this reroute. And let's keep in mind that both the tunnel and the reroute will cause damage to the water and the ecosystems, but are also completely in contradiction to what we need to do to act on climate change and what the International Energy Agency is saying and what the IPCC reports tell us about what we need to do right now. So it doesn't make sense for them to build these things, especially given the fact that we know that there are other alternatives we can turn to that can be implemented faster and that don't involve building new fossil fuel infrastructure and that allow us to shut the Line 5 pipeline down. So I can go a bit more into those as well, but something I also want to mention about the reroute is that, and this is where this is where I'm actually going to talk a bit about Line 3, is that there's a drilling method used, and it's called a horizontal directional drilling method. And experts and Enbridge themselves have admitted that this drilling method they would use for the reroute would cause damage to the water, would cause pollution to leak out into the water. And so with Line 3, when Line 3 was built, which number one, just as a fact, that pipeline that runs through Minnesota, and it connects to Line 3 at the Superior Terminal in Wisconsin. But that pipeline was actually built to double the capacity of the original line. And just saying that because this speaks to a larger plan of the fossil fuel sector or industry to continue to expand tar sands production and the movement and shipment of oil, crude oil. But in terms of what I was going to say with the drilling method, that drilling method was used for the Line 3 pipeline, and it did cause aquifer breaches, major aquifer breaches. Dozens of spills of chemical-laden drilling fluid happened that polluted the water of more than 60% of the horizontal directional drilling sites. And Enbridge, actually, there's evidence that shows that Enbridge was not doing its due diligence to stay on top of these incidents. And they didn't even tell state regulators or environmental monitors about the breach. And they also opted to continue construction for the pipeline and worry about fixing the aquifer later. So even just this past, that was just on one of the breaches. And this past summer, we found that in August, there was an aquifer breach that's in north central Minnesota. And over a year after the construction of Line 3 was completed, there was still more groundwater that was leaking from the aquifer. It's called a frack out, causing environmental harm. And so we have examples of when these things happen, these projects happen, and the harm that's caused. And here we are with all the people like the land defenders and water protectors who live along the route of the Line 3 pipeline that were predicting these things, scientists and Indigenous leadership and citizens predicting these things, that this would happen, and it did happen. And here we have Enbridge proposing to do the same thing with the reroute and building a tunnel, and we have the same thing, scientists, Indigenous leadership, concerned citizens saying, no, don't do this. This is all the reasons why. And they're trying to charge forward with these projects to keep Line 5 open. And we, as I said, we don't actually need this pipeline because we've had research done. Environmental Defense had research commissioned, as well as Bad River Band has had research commissioned to industry experts that look at other alternatives to meet crude oil needs in the near term, because I guess I'll say, like, as a water protector, it's not easy to talk about moving oil, period, because there's no good way to move oil. Sadly, we actually do have present day crude oil energy needs. There's different reasons for that. Part of it is because of the decades of being held back by regressive policies and lies by the fossil fuel industry, that we aren't further advanced with getting off of our dependence on fossil fuels. But this is the reality we're dealing with. So if we want to take away the threat of line 5, because of all of the factors at play that make it such a major imminent threat to the Great Lakes, we need to shift some of that burden. And Anishinaabe tribal leadership has talked about this, and we've talked about how these alternatives that we can turn to, which do involve using capacity of another pipeline that's newer and that's in the same system that can deliver the oil to Ontario and Quebec, can be used. And we know that we have these other alternatives that we can turn to. And I think an important point to note is that one of these the pipeline that I'm talking to that has spare capacity that we can shift some of the oil from line 5, a majority of the oil from line 5 to, it's also, that pipeline was designed to have greater capacity than it currently does. And as Anishinaabe, so that means we could shift even more of the product to that. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because as Anishinaabe tribal leadership and all the folks and the allies in the US were talking about this with each other, and as I was speaking with people about like weighing all the like pros and cons of what the different alternatives are in front of us to shut down the line 5 pipeline, it's very clear even to all the tribes that regardless of, if we can either decide that we want to protect the Great Lakes and we're going to shut down the line 5 pipeline, and we're going to temporarily in the interim shift some of the oil that's moving through it to other parts of the fossil fuel infrastructure system, as we continue to push to accelerate the phase out of fossil fuels. And shutting down line 5 wouldn't just protect the Great Lakes, but it would put more constraint on the pipeline system in terms of not allowing it to keep expanding. Because if you think about it, line 3 was built for double the capacity. This other pipeline that's part of the same system was also built for double the capacity, the one I'm talking about, line 78. Whether we shut down line 5 or not, they're going to try and use the fossil fuel industry are going to try to use all of that capacity that they can in the coming years. So we can either like constrain some of it by shutting down line 5 and moving it through that other pipeline, or we can keep line 5 open and they're just going to continue to try and expand the amount of oil moving through these pipelines anyways. So I don't know if that makes sense, kind of what I'm trying to say there, but I think it's an important point to note in all of this. And yeah, I think that for now, maybe I'll leave it there. Actually, one thing that I didn't say that is important in terms of Indigenous rights and sovereignty is that the tribes that are within the federally recognized tribes within Michigan and within Wisconsin are signed treaties, the Washington treaties in 1836 with the US government, which retains their right to be able to hunt, gather, fish, harvest, medicines, all of these things in their traditional lands and waters. And line 5 is a direct threat to those rights. Same on the Canadian side of the border with First Nations within so-called Canada, who also have rights that are affirmed by the Constitution and also, I mean, these rights that are affirmed by the Constitution extend to First Nations rights to assert jurisdiction, for example, the Anishinaabe here, to assert jurisdiction over the Great Lakes and to take the lead on like how we protect these waters and how we sustain the ability for Indigenous nations to continue to live their way of life here in the Great Lakes, and not be at threat because of things like a pipeline rupture from the line 5 pipeline. And then beyond those treaty rights that exist in the US case with the US government and in Canada between First Nations and the Crown, there's also these, which Deborah can speak more to as well, but there's the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples that have existed since time immemorial, before any treaties were signed with colonial bodies or institutions. And another important fact that, as I'm speaking about treaties, and then I will leave it there, is the 1977 treaty is a pipeline treaty that Canada is currently using and has used twice with the cases in Michigan and the Bad River Band case to try and circumvent, to work alongside Enbridge to try and circumvent and overturn tribal rights within the US legal system. And so to keep, as a way to keep the pipeline open, Canada's doing this. They're using this treaty with Enbridge to, work alongside them, keep the pipeline open. And this 1977 treaty makes no mention of Indigenous nations rights, of First Nations rights, of tribal rights, none of that. And obviously doesn't take into context the current energy system, like what's at play with our global energy system and the energy transition and revolution that we're in. So it's really problematic for them to be using this treaty, the 1977 treaty, for a number of reasons. And it's also problematic that in the US, the Biden administration and the state level governments will at least speak to the concerned citizens and public about Line 5 and take their concerns seriously. In Canada, as one of the only people working on this right now, they don't want to do that. They don't want to talk about it. The only people that they're interested in talking with is Enbridge and Enbridge's allies. And I think that's extremely concerning, that given the immense threat this pipeline poses, the fact that people have done their homework to find solutions for shutting it down, and still the Canadian government currently is not choosing to come to the table and speak to the people that are actually concerned about the pipeline. And they're not even speaking to First Nations about it either. So I just find that extremely problematic, and in some ways undemocratic as well. And I will leave it there.
Michelle, when you were explaining a lot of this, you were talking about Anishinaabe connection to water, and I wanted to turn to Deb and ask you about like Anishinaabe connection to water and what all of these issues that Michelle was explaining have to do with livelihood and also treaty rights and recognition of Indigenous sovereignty. And
Okay. Thank you for that, Michelle. I think you covered a lot of the ground. But before I jump into it, Miranda, I just wanted to sort of address part of the first question that also Michelle was addressing, was around the health of the Great Lakes. But what I did want to say about, because they also changed how the health of the Great Lakes is reported on with the from when they used to have what they actually used to call the State of the Great Lakes Health Ecosystem Conferences, which used to happen every 2 years. And then they switched it up when the new Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement came in, and now it's sort of reported through the IJC. But in my work over the years, sort of what I call more the policy governance orientation that I did with Chiefs of Ontario was, and also when I worked for Environment Canada, was the indicators the indicators that are developed, they have a very, they're very Western science biased. So it's whatever people can measure then becomes, that's what inputs into what the state of the Great Lakes health is. Some of the other challenges around that, where scientists essentially use very different methodologies for this. So how people are measuring things, let's say in Ontario, Quebec, if you're including St. Lawrence, versus the states that are around the Great Lakes versus the federal governments, they're not always using the same methodologies for assessing whatever it is that they're assessing, whether that's aquatic invasive species or biological or chemical integrity of the Great Lakes, whatever it is. So there's always gaps in knowledge, and probably one of the biggest gaps is in Indigenous assessments. So Indigenous peoples have their own assessments of the Great Lakes, and that is not there. So even with when the State of the Great Lakes ecosystem reports used to come out, or now the IJC reports, they're really grossly inadequate in terms of what Indigenous assessments would be based on their own indicators. So that's not there. They do mention you know, in a 300 or 700 or 500 page report, oh, First Nations there's drinking water quality situations, and they might mention that, but there's actually hardly anything. People have no idea about what the situation is, particularly in First Nation communities. So there was a period of time when we were trying to develop indicators that kind of made sense in a First Nation context, because people understand health a lot more holistically. It isn't just what you can measure, what you can count. There's other aspects of one's relationship to the Great Lakes other than you know, the types of scientific assessments. And I'm not saying they're wrong or bad to do. They're not telling the whole story. There's a lot more to the story that's not there. So when there would be public meetings, First Nations and Métis would show up and they would give their version of State of the Great Lakes. And, you know, folks who work on these reports have no idea what to do with that in terms of including it into these assessments. A colleague of mine worked with a lot on Great Lakes work. He worked on it more than I did. He worked on initially the Eagle Project work, which was the effects of the Great Lakes ecosystem on Indigenous peoples. This was in late 80s, early 90s. He worked on that. So people have been concerned about this in this kind of formal setting for quite some time. He always thought that First Nations and Métis should be able to do their own assessments. We should have our own gatherings like this and then put our own report together in terms of what we consider to be the health of the Great Lakes, because it is just not there aren't indicators there that First Nations people, Métis people, Inuit are not Inuit per se because they don't have the territories around the Great Lakes. That's totally missing from there. So what we know has huge gaps, and how people are impacted is quite different. So I wanted to mention that because that still persists, even in the Canada-Ontario agreement, or what it might be looking like in the United States when they have the international, and then whatever the agreement looks like for the domestic arrangements, is there's still gaps in terms of the types of programs that are available to First Nations. And what I'll say about in the Canadian context is they'll just say, well, province will just say it's not our jurisdiction, it's federal. So you end up with that jurisdictional gap thing happens a lot. So for example, a provincial climate change pilot initiative around Great Lakes. I remember it was a Great Lakes and climate change project. There were no First Nation ones because it was a different jurisdiction. So they have nothing on that. They have no idea how First Nations are impacted by any of this, or their understanding of the Great Lakes. Another issue that came up, sorry, I'm going on about this, but I just wanted to point out that there's major gaps and flaws in what we know about the Great Lakes. And one of the comments that's come up continually because a lot of my work on this is to facilitate meetings. We bring different First Nations together from around the Great Lakes and discuss these issues, is they don't get to lead their own research. So Indigenous people are participating in other people's research questions, what they understand to be the problem. And First Nations don't get to define what their questions are, what they define the problem to be, and then answer them. So there might be a big emphasis on certain aquatic invasive species for economic reasons or whatever, and First Nations might get involved in someone else's research project because that's what's important to them, but maybe a different species is actually really important to First Nations for cultural reasons. And that doesn't, it's like, wow, that's not whatever. So they don't get the assistance that they need to be able to fully understand what the health is and what the impacts are in terms of First Nation context. So those are just some of the issues that have come up. So when I hear, okay, that it's flawed, I know it, I know it is, because there's so much information missing. And people didn't really have a chance to be able to develop some of those indicators. Later on, maybe I can talk about what some of the neat ones were that people were proposing. But even when they are Great Lakes managers, wherever they are, state, provincial, or ENGO, they don't necessarily know what to do with that information anyway. It's sort of like, we don't know how to fit that into our frameworks. Like we don't know, we don't know how to do that. Sort of relates to the second half of the question that you were asking me. So I did want to mention that because it's been a huge issue and continues to be the difference of opinion in terms of the state of the Great Lakes. And I think what would be argued is that probably since the 70s, the state of the Great Lakes is improving, but from a particular perspective, but maybe not necessarily from an Indigenous perspective, and depending on where you are, that would also differ. So I did want to mention that because it is important to look at those reports critically and ask questions around, where's the Indigenous input into this? Where's their Indigenous knowledge? How do they understand the health of the Great Lakes? Because that relationship is so close, because if the Great Lakes are not well, then Indigenous peoples aren't going to be either, and vice versa. Because people still, I don't want to say depend, because it's more reciprocal than that. People's engagement and people's living with, or life ways, or way of life in relation to the Great Lakes is so intertwined. So now we'll get to your question. So I don't know. So I just want to lay that out there because that work was never completed. So First Nations know, we always say First Nations know, but it's not known elsewhere. And then people are making decisions around Great Lakes health and ecosystem health, but they're basing it on incomplete information and experience in doing that. So, okay, to get to your question, I realize it's almost 7 o'clock, so I'll try to, so we want to entertain questions as well. So what I wanted to say about it was, Michelle did a great job of talking about a lot what those kind of relationships are, but one thing that probably for me, one of the first times when it became, I guess, part of the world that I was existing in, other than like my lived experience kind of world, is when I was asked to write or prepare the traditional knowledge report for the Walkerton Commission that the Chiefs of Ontario was submitting. So I traveled around and talked to different knowledge holders and grandmothers and grandfathers to kind of get their understanding of water in relation to, like, what's our submission going to be for this. And I traveled down to Walpole Island, and I met with the Akikwe women's group. So this was arranged for me to talk to them. And that's when when I first started hearing it explicitly about our relationship to water, like that spiritual, cultural kind of relationship. The other stuff was obvious to me. Of course, we need to fish. We travel on water. We get our medicines from the water. Like that to me was kind of obvious because where I grew up, like we didn't even talk about it because it was just part of the way that you lived. It was just, that's what you do. And so they talked about that spiritual, what people call the spiritual and cultural part. I think now I would probably call it, a lot of it was laws. They were talking about those deep laws that guide what that relationship is going to look like between people and the waters. And it was the first time that I'd heard that, because I'm working in these governance circles, right? I'm working in these circles where it's actually, when I first started working on this, primarily men. Actually, I'd be like the only woman, and I was a facilitator. And so it was very much about rights, which is important. Like, absolutely. Like, that's the mandate of the political organizations, Aboriginal and treaty rights, assertions of sovereignty, and self-determination. And then I was hearing this completely other perspective, but it was falling kind of under the realm of like traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge. And so they had been performing or conducting ceremonies because Walpole Island's right down from Chemical Valley as well, right? And they saw the impacts in terms of their community, their own children, and in themselves. And I hadn't thought about it in that way as part of governance. Isn't the best word for it. Maybe caretaking or relationship coexistence, I guess, with the Great Lakes. but Great Lakes isn't even like the Great Lakes. Each lake has its own kind of personality and its own, I guess, way of being a lake. And so, so that they, but that really wasn't part of what people were talking about at the time. And so, and that they had already been doing this. And I remember maybe actually not that long ago, I think it was around the time that Human Rights Watch did their report on water. I think that was 2016. And they talked about how they were presenting this at some United Nations forum of some kind or another. And they said, for the first time, a water ceremony was performed. But it actually was at United Nations, but it actually wasn't true. Aggie had been doing that for decades before. Because I remember one of them whispered over to me, like, we already did that, like, 10 years ago. So, but it was sort of understated. It was always there, but it wasn't part of the domain of conversations around rights and governance and relationships in relation to the Great Lakes. So anyway, so that report came out, and specifically one of the things that they said was women's relationship to water. Again, which when I think about it was always there when I was growing up, but it was sort of understood, so you didn't have to talk about it. But there we had to talk about it explicitly because women were so excluded. Like I said, like most of the leadership are not women. Most of the meetings, not women there. So you didn't get this perspective. I would say now when I'm facilitating meetings, now it's mostly women and usually young women. Actually, it's changed quite dramatically even over my career. So now it's part of the conversation, but it was really hard to sort of get it into the conversation and the dialogue initially. So you kind of had to crack the code within Indigenous communities in the first place, because that wasn't how politics and governance worked. And then you had to try to get it into other circles, I don't think it's mentioned. I don't think it is actually. It's not part of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, those kind of relationships. Maybe I think they tried to go there a bit with the Great Lakes Protection Act provincially, but then not really. So there's still a long way to go in terms of that, but at least we have the conversations. Probably the catalyst, I think, for me, probably the biggest influence for me was the late grandmother Josephine Mondawman's work around the Great Lakes. She probably, that, I don't want to even say movement because she wouldn't like that. That's not her thing. That alone raised the awareness, but from the grassroots. So it went from the grassroots and then it went up, as opposed to some of the work I was doing, which was working at the political governance level and trying to raise it there. So I think it's kind of converged. I don't really go to any kind of water meeting around the Great Lakes where that isn't discussed anymore. And maybe I'm probably going to certain kind of Great Lakes meetings, probably not going to the highly technical, we're developing yet another model of how to assess Great Lakes health kind of meeting. I don't go to too many of those, but now I would say it's kind of a thing, right? It's in the radar. So that's why I wanted to start with that, because it wasn't there before. Even though it was always there in the communities, it wasn't part of these other realms. It's not part of these assessments. There's no discussion around, even with Indigenous indicators, what might be a distinct indicator coming from women for some of this work, which happens, I think, in other spaces. So the other part of the question is, and again, I think Michelle did a great job of talking about what some of those relationships are. But now I think what I wanted to say was we're trying to formalize that now in communities, because we weren't controlling water like we did for thousands of years. And colonization really has been relatively recent in terms of the undermining of what that relationship and caretaking, or whatever words people want to use, coexistence in relation to water, because it's understood water is more powerful than we are. It is. So you will coexist. Some argue, I shouldn't say argue, some will say that we're actually governed by water. And so that's how you approach it. You don't approach it through, we need to figure out how to govern water through all these acts and legislation and treaties and everything else. It's actually that should really reflect how we're actually governed by water, because it is more powerful than we are. So was how do we start to formalize that even in our own communities when we don't control it? So if you're a First Nation, then it's federal jurisdiction. And there really is not any kind of, I guess, support for a self-determined relationship in relation to water. It's more very technical, very techno-fix kind of thing. Let's just build a water treatment plant, hope for the best. And as Miranda pointed out, like right now where I'm right now, I'm not on the central system in the First Nation. It's well or surface water. When I grew up, it was surface water. That's where we got it. We just went down to the lake and got the water. Here it's a well. So I'm not on that system, actually. So it's very, so how do you do this in a particular context? How do we start taking this back in terms of our communities? So people know how to relate to you other than just being, oh, you're an interest group or a stakeholder, or maybe we recognize you as rights holder, maybe we'll involve you in our decision making, not maybe people getting involved in our decision making. And that's through work that some communities have done in Ontario and across the country around, I guess the formal word for it would be source water protection planning at the community level. And in my community, that's what we did. And I think we didn't like the template that was developed by some engineer type from out west that INAC then, when there was INAC developed and said that's the one we should use. It wasn't very good, actually. So we developed our own. We looked at some of the most rigorous and included our, like, the basis of it would be our own perspective. So in that source water protection plan, I think we call it something different though. We included how the cultural and ceremony and relationship part of it would be included in that. So ceremonies is part of that plan. At certain times of the year that are significant, and that would change depending on where you are. So where I am around Manitoulin, that's going to be different than around Walpole Island, which is going to be different around Lake Superior. So ceremonial aspects would be included in that. Our seasons, like the way we understand how the world, like our science, then informs that particular source water protection plan. The other part of it too is water is often just understood as H2O and liquid, but in doing this work, so water is also ice, water is also snow, the ability to travel. And this was one of those, I guess, working in the realm that I was working in, I always started from that ontology of water as H2O, and then I was corrected, but usually people looked at me like I was some kind of idiot. So when you realize, like, got to get out more as a researcher and I should know this. And it was when I was asking people, because generally people lived close to the water, some kind of water, but not everybody did, like that we were talking to as part of this work when we were developing the source water protection plan as part of talking to people in the community. Some of them were kilometers away, and I said, well, where did you get your water when it was like it would have been really hard to get down to the water? And they just said, from the snow. Like, are you some kind of idiot? We get it from the snow, we get it from the ice. I went, that's right, I remember that. We used to collect the snow and we'd melt that. That was how we got water. So water isn't just H2O. Water is all the shapes and forms that water takes. That's how it's understood. And then you develop your plan around that, not just around H2O, the H2O that we get just for human need for drinking. So it has a very human-centric bias to it, how we approach this. And also in terms of even how we understand water in the first place. And so all of that was challenged for me. And I went, oh, that's right. And actually people move faster in the winter than they do in the summer because you can move across the ice. So there was a whole bunch of that. Once you understood water is a lot broader than H2O, then you start to, I think you get a better understanding of Anishinaabeg perspectives of water, not just in all its forms. Even, I guess, what people would call the water cycle in terms of fog and in terms of rain, like how we understand the different forms that water takes. So it isn't just H2O, although that's important. And in this work also, it wasn't so human-centric. It was about, okay, what did the fish need? What does the wildlife need? What did the medicines need? What do the spirits need? Because there's also spirit beings in the water that also need to be taken care of and included as part of governance. And a lot of them are more powerful than we are as well. So it's way more expensive than is understood. I think than is commonly understood is that would be included as part of source water protection. I'll just end here so there's time for conversation and questions. Is I think one of the places where this has been captured well, and it's not in the Great Lakes per se, but it's part of the elders and the women as part of Treaty 3. They developed a toolkit and a declaration based on these elements that I talked about. Like they included that as part of there. We're also taking care of these other spirit beings in how we relate to water. It isn't just about us. So they developed a pretty, I haven't seen anything like that for the Great Lakes that they developed in that particular area, but they're in Anishinaabe as well. And it's very similar. We kind of did it at they did it at a treaty level, Treaty 3 level. We did it more at a community level. So I'll stop there so that there's time for conversation.
I do have a question for you because I've actually met quite a few people from your home community more recently, or from other areas around Manitoulin Island, and they've been describing to me the water quality issues for Whitefish First Nation. And I'm wondering, could you just explain that to us and like what communities like Whitefish are facing?
You still can't drink the water. I mean, you could, I suppose, depending on where you are. Like you don't. So when I was growing up, even in my lifetime, you can't do it anymore. That's what we did. We went down to the water. We got it for everything. You can't do that. You have if I'm getting the water from surface or from the well, it's filtered. So it's still, so it has to be still treated in some way. But really, but Whitefish River's water quality is actually really good. I mean, in terms of, they always have this big contest at the Ontario, we just call it TechCorps, First Nations Technical Services Corporation. Have this big contest for who's got the cleanest and the best water. And actually Whitefish River wins a lot. But that's like the treated water. So, but in terms of threats, there's a lot. And I would say a lot of it isn't coming from the community itself. It's like, right, I would look out and I see like the cottage industry, the cottagers, and they're just throwing whatever out there, big fancy yachts and like gross stuff being released into the water. On the other side, because the community is surrounded, so one area we call, it's like the McGregor Bay side, and then the other one is Bay of Islands side. So that side is Spanish River. That was a hotspot, an area of concern around the Great Lakes. So that's pulp and paper. So that comes spewing out. Sudbury's not that far either. And so some lakes are actually dead around from the acid rain era up in Killarney Park. So a lot of the threats to the community are actually external, just the high volume now of the boat traffic and the vehicle traffic now. So the potential for things being dumped and wasted, the levels of water. So people don't think of that. So one thing about the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement is that they don't like to go down the quantity side of things. We just do quality. We don't do quantity. So again, totally reductionist, not a holistic perspective at all. But the water levels have dropped quite dramatically. Actually, I went down to the shore and I went, wow, I didn't even know that flat area was there. Like it's quite dramatic. So most of the threats are identified as coming off reserve. Like actually I can look out over here and I could see, it looks like some kind of fish farm situation. And then people are feeding whatever, and there's no way to regulate it actually because of like people complain, but right now the province of Ontario has very lax environmental protection, anything. Major cuts to, there isn't even a Ministry of the Environment anymore, actually. So there isn't even anybody to enforce or to deal with that particular situation, even when different violations occur. So when we did our plan, part of the issue was to was how do you start developing the relationships that folks external to the community, because they were causing the problems experienced in the First Nation, because water doesn't care whether it's provincial or federal jurisdiction. There probably could be better relationships with the cottager associations. I wouldn't say they're great right now, and that's for some of the issues that also Miranda talked about, the land issues. They want to they want to lock up land in like land trusts and other kind of arrangements, so that First Nations, so because there's big major land claims in the area, so they can't control it and they can't do what they want to do to be able to support their communities, because these conservation type people think that they know best about what's best for the land and what the people who've lived here for thousands of years and still, relate to the land in the way that we would like to, in order to be able to support our lives and identity and language and rights and everything else. Almost like everything about us is a big threat. It's a big threat to people. There's still that kind of mentality that exists in this area.
And just like on point of that, there was a treaty issue more recently on Manitoulin Island as well, where the cottagers said, oh no, these are our cottages. But we don't have to get into it.
It's a big issue, yeah. And people locking up land in different kind of arrangements, so people can't, very specifically, like learning about treaties, but in a bad way, like not in a supportive or good way.
Mm-hmm. Yes, a couple questions that I wanted to just ask to both of you is how people can get involved. So like Michelle in specific, what can be done in Canada to support Indigenous nations of the Great Lakes, particularly the Anishinaabe nations on both sides of the border, who are seeking the permanent closure of Line 5?
I'm not muted. Okay, good. Well, I think it starts in general, just first, we need more people who are not Indigenous and not Anishinaabe to understand that the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and other Indigenous nations of this area, but the Anishinaabe are, that these people have been here, these nations have been here, as we've said more than once, for thousands of years. I mean, we have documented history in the West of like Indigenous peoples being there for 15,000 plus years. And so that connection would have existed over here. And so it would be the same for here since time immemorial, these nations, these people are still here, as Deborah said, right? And that there's like names of places that are over 10,000 years old. All of these water bodies, all of these lands, all of these places have names. They're not all the same. There's like Haudenosaunee name, and there'll be an Anishinaabe name. But this is all important because it does tell a story pre-colonization of the peoples who were here, that so many, I feel like there's a lot of people that I go and speak to that just because of the way our school system works, don't even know, like, if you're like, do you know who the Anishinaabe are? And they don't even know. And I'm like, they've been here for over 10,000 years and have been taking care of this place and area. Or the Haudenosaunee, do you know who they are? And they don't know. And I mean, can you fully blame people when they're not really we're not living in a system that really teaches these things to mainstream society. And so that's important, because when it comes to any issue of protecting the water and protecting the Great Lakes, it really needs to settle into people the importance of taking the lead and listening to Anishinaabe leadership and to other Indigenous leadership such as Haudenosaunee, and to start questioning kind of what Deborah's even touched on, these sort of Eurocentric, settler-centric ways of viewing how we manage water and our relationship to water. And just there's this huge disconnect that I see that impacts people's sense of responsibility or urgency to support Indigenous nations who are working to fight to protect the water and stand up for the water and stand up for the Great Lakes, because they do still, like, it hasn't fully settled in, and then they do still kind of lack this sense of like just how significant this is. Like, the sacred teachings that are over 10,000 years old, that there's instructions that were given to Indigenous peoples of how to live in harmony with the land and with each other, that we're not doing that. Like, not as a society, we're not doing it, and many Indigenous peoples are still trying to do it, and some non-Indigenous peoples are trying to live that way, but collectively we're not living in that way, in alignment with those original instructions of this part of the world that are over 10,000 years old, that are also embedded in things like the teachings, the language, and the water, the spaces, everything. But when you do start to understand that, then it like helps to understand that if you have a nation of peoples like the Anishinaabe Nation across borders, across not just US state borders, but across US Canada borders, across the Great Lakes borders, who are all saying that Line 5 is a major threat, that it needs to be shut down, then we need to take that seriously, and we need to not give so much credibility to arguments being made to keep it open, that are being made by the company who owns it, and are being made by a government that has proven and shown that it's very pro fossil fuel and is not really as all in on climate change and things like that as it likes to say it is, when you look at the evidence and with what's going on with like the tar sands and things like that. The tar sand CGL pipeline out west, TMX, and here we've got like Line 5. We've seen what just happened with Line 3. And, so we need to listen to Indigenous peoples. We need to stand by them. We need to stand together as Indigenous peoples. Actually, we need to stand together, because the other interesting thing about Line 5, and I will get to an action that people can take at the end of this, but the other interesting thing about Line 5 and just like the location and the Great Lakes is that this pipeline and the colonial borders that like separate, for example, the archipelago of islands, like from Manitoulin Island to Mackinac Island, that's beside the Straits of Mackinac, that colonial border it's real, but in a sense it's also imaginary. Like, it didn't exist there before, and it separates one larger nation of peoples, of the Anishinaabe peoples, right? Like, it cuts right through it, and Line 5 is at like the heart of the center of like these nations, and you have this kind of like ongoing colonial violence and environmental racism happening from pipelines like Line 5, and happening from the corporations that own them and the political allies that stand beside these corporations. And we need to acknowledge this and call it out for what it is. We see Canada, and not just Canada, but let's speak about Canada because we're in what's currently called Canada, consistently putting the fossil fuel economy ahead of things like the Great Lakes for a pipeline we don't need. Like, it's so, I don't even know what word I want to give it, but it's really awful that at the end of the day, it's essentially like trying to buy off the Great Lakes for profit. It's really nothing more than that. And while we're facing a climate crisis, a freshwater crisis, a biodiversity crisis, and we have solutions and answers. So I just don't understand. Like, I do understand why we're not going in the right way, why it's not just like common sense to everybody, shut it down right now, right away, because also very powerful people, there's a lot at stake, profits are at stake, money is at stake, power is at stake. And those same people that want to keep the pipeline open also have a lot of power and money to spread information into mainstream media, into the public's consciousness, to kind of create these falsehoods in people's minds of like, do we actually need a pipeline like Line 5? Is Line 5 safe, like this Enbridge company is saying it is? So I think in terms of like what we can do in the taking action, we really need to educate ourselves and each other more on what's going on with this particular pipeline and how it fits into a broader, bigger picture of Indigenous rights, protecting water, and acting on climate change. And we need more people to be getting activated from the grassroots level. We do need to see solidarity and unity across borders for Indigenous nations, for non-Indigenous allies. We need that. And I think line 5 is similar, like we saw, for example, with how the DAPL pipeline brought together people across borders. And line 5 is similar in the sense that it is an international fight, right? Like it impacts people on all sides of these borders. So we need to have the grassroots become more activated and to show more resistance and solidarity against having this pipeline stay in operation and speaking up to the Canadian government. I do have right now, I'm going to drop our action in the chat that folks can take, like folks can sign this, because right now we do have a petition you can sign to send to the Canadian government, asking them to essentially prioritize the protection of the Great Lakes, prioritize Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous rights, prioritize the phasing out of fossil fuels, and shut down this pipeline and turn to the alternatives that multiple experts have now said are within reach. So I'll drop that in the chat. And I would just say that if folks are concerned, I'm also just seeing somebody say we need to fight for it in Bill 23. And yes, you are right. And environmental defense is doing a lot of that along other groups as well. But I'd say if folks are concerned, you can do things like you can write to the newspaper, you can write like something in the newspaper, an opinion editorial, you can call your MPP, you can call your MP, you can head to Environmental Defense's website or do some research from different environmental organizations and Indigenous nations who've been working on this to look at like collectively why everyone's so concerned. You know, I've shared some things today, and you can take that with you and you can call your elected officials, because I think that they do need to see that there's people here that are concerned, because right now Canada's just kind of been acting in a way that it's like it's speaking for all Canadians as if we all are okay with this pipeline, when that's not the case. So that would be some of kind of like you can sign this petition, and yeah, like I said, call your elected officials, talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors when things like this come up, so that you can help to debunk and diffuse some of this like false information that's being spread by Enbridge about the safety of the pipeline and about our true need for the pipeline.
I think you tied a lot of things in there, like environmental assessments being done by the company and not by a federal agency or by another type of agency, which is always problematic. But then also pipelines over people, especially when it comes to Indigenous communities and Indigenous rights. And then we also have like the criminality of land defenders and environmental protectors. So there's just so much that we can debunk there. But then also, Deb, I wanted to throw it to you, and with your experience working with different agencies, especially like the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement or the International Joint Commission, like how can these agencies that are supposed to be governing and like helping the Great Lakes for future generations incorporate more Indigenous knowledges? And I know that's a slow process. Like more recently, Henry Lickers is on the scientific advisory of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, if I'm correct. And I just wanted to ask, like, what is your opinion there?
It's a good question, and I just want to thank Michelle for her comments. I think, yeah, everybody did what she was saying. We might have a different scenario in front of us. It took a long time for finally Indigenous appointments a part of it, but the International Joint Commission isn't really, they're not really like a big decision maker. They more report to the public, like they're more, there's hearings. And so I think it's important because they have the visibility. And I found, having gone to some of their meetings before and presented at them, the commissioners just they didn't know what you were saying or how to process it. Like they just go, that's nice, and next, and then next people would present. So at least now there's people there who kind of get it. Because also Dean Jacobs also was, I don't know if he's still there, a part of, I think he was part of the community, maybe engagement, sort of part of the International Joint Commission. So I think there's still, that took a very long time. And although we did make a note that they didn't put any women there. So we did notice that. So I think it is helpful because it raises the visibility. Like that'll be what they do. Like they'll talk about things. There's going to be somebody at the table who understands what people are saying when they're presenting their remarks or reporting on what's happening, as opposed to it just went over people's heads. It used to drive me crazy. I think there's still more work to do, because what tends to end up, let's say in something like the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement or the Canada-Ontario Agreement, I find they tend to include things that aren't really a threat to the state sovereignty. So we'll recognize Indigenous knowledge, but we actually don't want to necessarily recognize Indigenous rights, or Indigenous people's kind of way of life. So it's kind of like the safe things end up in there that aren't necessarily going to be, a threat to the status quo and decision making. You sort of get included or wrapped up in somebody else's kind of process without the recognition of your own. And that part hasn't happened. So I think there's definitely still a lot more work to do there. There was a couple of things I did want to mention, though. I think Indigenous nations have been organized around the Great Lakes as well. I think it was maybe 2004 was the Tribe First Nation Accord from around the Great Lakes. There was another initiative around 2011 that I was at, so these are treaties among the nations in terms of their commitments to the Great Lakes. So those also need to be respected. So we're not always necessarily engaging in with the states because it's very limiting, but we're also trying to do what we can do based on our own authority and jurisdiction, and sovereignty and knowledge and responsibilities, and rights. So I think that work also needs to be supported. Very hard to get support for that. And it tends to be, in some respects, reactionary. So the Tribal First Nation Accord was more around the Great Lake bulk export issue at the time. So they tend to, as opposed to, we already have treaties, like how about respecting those, like everybody, not just asking the governments to do it? How about those land trust folks or those cottage association types or municipalities? Like everybody respect them, like whether you're an individual or part of an organization. So those already exist and they're legal and they should be respected, as opposed to people thinking of ways to undermine them, which is unfortunately a lot of what happens. I think for the average person, I have to say I was quite mortified when the Ford government got in with an overwhelming majority. Like I thought, how the hell did that happen? So there's, in my opinion, because of that, there's a lot of responsibility on individuals to just say, whatever the heck you're doing, grossly unacceptable. We want somebody else as decision maker. So in my opinion, because of that kind of result, there's a lot on the individual as well, not just like on the bigger system and whatever else. So I would say, so there's that component too, but now we're kind of in this situation, and sometimes you're always trying to pick the lesser of the evils, right? Unfortunately, feels like that a lot of the times. But I think sometimes what we need to have also is an imagination to just go, what would it look like if it wasn't that? Like what is it that we would actually envision and try to strive for? This is a problem across the board. Like when I think about the climate crisis or planetary health crisis, because it's also biodiversity and water and climate and other aspects of planetary, I prefer to say well-being. There's transformation being called for all the time, but people have no idea what that looks like. They have no idea. What does a transformed governance around Great Lakes look like? people have a hard time with that. I mean, I could ask people that and they don't know how to answer the question. And so that requires some imagination. So what I think Indigenous peoples can offer, not like our knowledge, but everything else about our lives, is that we had to do that. We transformed, because the way that I grew up and the way that my great-grandparents lived in the Great Lakes, people still know, we still know what it's like to transform and survive and live and try to live well in the place that we live in. Other people, they don't know what that looks like. They have no idea what can transformation look like. And this is where I think Indigenous peoples can be leaders in that, because we had to do it. Not everybody else is facing the crisis we did. And they're kind of going, oh my God. It's like, well, been there, done that. Maybe there's something to learn. And the other view that I have in terms of mainstream processes is that they're inherently flawed, because they're based on a logic of human dominance over nature, economic, what would be the other word, national interests, the public good, ill-defined, what does that mean? And that those laws are always going to fail Indigenous peoples and the natural world. So a lot of work I do more recently is around Indigenous law. I'm like, okay, what do other laws look like? What were the laws that functioned here for thousands of years and worked? And they still exist. That's really most of the history of the Great Lakes, is really those laws, that knowledge, that governance. And it's all its diversity, because there's other nations, Haudenosaunee, there's Menominee, there's other Ho-Chunk, there's other nations around the Great Lakes. And we figured out how these laws work together. So there isn't a lot of imagination around that. To some extent, someone like Dr. Kelsey Leonard at Waterloo would say, so she's looking at rights of nature, personhood of nature. Is that being a place where, I guess in our context, common law might intersect with Indigenous law? But you have to, I think when you draw on what worked for thousands of years, I'm not saying we were perfect. The difference was when we had a challenge, we could deal with it on our terms. Now we can't. We have to deal with all kinds of other people's BS all the time. We don't get to do our own thing a lot of the time, the way we would have dealt with challenges that we faced. So I don't have faith in the system. I think you need to transform it. There needs to be something else to replace it. And that something else already exists. If people would just sort of just respect rather than try to undermine. So I guess the message I'll end with is just like, what I would say to people: stop the harm, like stop it. Like, it's still going on. Why is that? Despite what we know, TRC came out, Royal Commission came out, Murder and Missing Indigenous Women came out. Like, why is there still harm, right? And I imagine most people feel they're good people, so we have to stop the harm, and then you have somewhere to start. Like you stop that, including pipeline, like stop, and then you can start imagining what the world could look like and what it could be. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you for sharing, Deb. I wanted to say, let's go to the chat. And one person has written, as Anishinaabe, Bad River is one of our most sacred areas and holds the Southern Lodge within the Council of Three Fires. Can this be used as an international political influence towards forcing the hand towards positive action?
I'm just looking at the question right now. I don't know that I can answer this one, because, and I don't know if, like, Deborah, you could if you would be able to speak to that, because you probably have more knowledge about that than I do when it comes to things like the Council of the Three Fires. And I'm not really, yeah, I guess I'm not sure how that would be used for what they're asking right now.
Yeah, just looking at the question, my view of it would probably, I mean, you could do all kinds of things, but maybe I'm just in a bad mood today, but I think the outcome would be like Dakota Access Pipeline. Like that's what people were doing, right? They were fighting and defending and protecting sacred aspects of people's lives. Just because of, like, when I think about case law and people have put forward, because it has to go under religion. that's a big part of the problem, like legally, then it goes under religion. That's not well protected. In Canadian law anyway. I don't know about, I don't know about in the US context. So as I read that, I'm like, but when the good thing about it though is that we can say, well, Dakota Access Pipeline, they did a great, despite it, the outcome being the way that it was, there are so many people who now know about Indigenous people's relationship to water. So there could still be a lot of that kind of work, but there isn't really, again, that system of laws in place to be able to have sort of the positive outcome you'd like to have here in relation. That's yeah, just based on what I've seen before, that's sort of what my answer might be for something like that, unless they were meaning like other kind of influence other than going through the systems in Canada, US, or whatever states might be involved.
I'm also thinking like in terms of when it comes to protecting the sacred, I guess that can be used for the people that understand like what that really means. I think that from an international like political influence, like it could apply like social pressure, or it could remove it helps in building your case to like delegitimize corporation like fossil fuel corporations from having the social license to operate. So things like that, I think, could have like if you can get people to understand the really important aspect of like sacred areas and sacred places. But this is also something that this is just making me think that I find it challenging, and I know that a lot of other Indigenous people find it challenging to, if you're speaking to people who don't understand, like, and I don't even understand or know all of the teachings or anything like that, but based off of what I do know and understand, and if you're speaking to people who have almost like no understanding of that, or who are like very like secular or atheist or whatnot, or don't consider themselves spiritual, and a lot of like all of these decision-making bodies like the IJC, the Great Lakes Commission, they're all like they separate from like the spiritual world, but for Indigenous peoples and governing water and everything like that, they're just and anything like there is no separation. And we do get like how sacred these places are, and that you can't talk about protecting water without understanding the spiritual importance and significance of doing so. And that creates this like greater sense of urgency and responsibility in some of the people who do understand what I'm saying right now. But it's hard because I find it challenging. If people don't have that context and understanding, it's not going to resonate or land with them the same when you say protect the sacred. It's, I don't know. That's just kind of like a tangent thought that I had right now with that question.
I do understand that Bad River is located in Wisconsin. So I guess like the political makeup of that question is a little bit different as well. Like I'm located in Toronto, and the Canadian political system seemed to have a lot of ways of overriding Indigenous rights, even when it comes to things that have been written into Canadian law, like the idea of Aboriginal rights and title, and then also different rights and jurisdictions that they've given specifically to certain nations for particular parts of land. And what I'm thinking about right now is issues that are happening with Coastal GasLink pipeline on the West Coast, and how it's written into jurisdiction for the hereditary chiefs to have final decision-making power on that territory. But they use these types of like politics to even just like get over the laws that Canada has created to create more laws so that the projects can still go through. So in Canada, we have what's called an injunction, and that kind of like gives the corporation more law and more jurisdiction than Canada itself, so that the pipeline can go through, because it's, in their idea of what an infringement of an Aboriginal right can be. It's like, oh no, that pipeline's going to make a lot of money. And so that's good for Canada, and that's good for the settlers of Canada. That's good for Canada's economy, and therefore it has more precedent for the rest of Canada than the nation who has and the legal system that has decision-making power in that area. So it's loaded. And it being in the United States, I feel like it's even more difficult to answer a question like that, because the politics really change with the different administrations. Like in the Trump era, it's completely different. Well, maybe not a completely different thing, but it's slightly different in the Biden era, right? So, but I also, the same person asked about reducing impacts on, so most drilling is specialized, and so essentially how,
I think we both answered the question already in different ways.
oh, really?
That one,
Great.
yeah.
Let's move
I said
forward.
Indigenous laws, the other ones don't work, and I think
Molly.
Hmm.
So great. Um, Melanie asked, while we're on this topic, and how about the abuse of the notwithstanding clause? Would someone be able to explain what the notwithstanding clause is and what this means?
Deborah, do you want to take a crack at it? I can a little bit too, but you can.
Well, I just know that's what the province did to sort of get out of. Did they use it for undermining the sorry, I avoid the news because it's always bad news a lot of the times. Was that for to oppress the public educators, or was that just to get out of having to testify?
No, they used it for they used it against the public education workers to prevent them from striking. And I mean, it's off, like, yeah, that it's really awful. And I think right now, like, what the Ford government is doing in terms of like Bill 23 is horrendous. It's so horrendous. And it's undoing a lot of decades of environmental protections. And like even the way that like the government's opening up the greenbelt protected area to development, like that's for the premier's friends, his actual like developer friends who give him money to remain in power, or to be like, so yeah, that is awful. And like the context that we're facing in Ontario right now when it comes to trying to protect the environment is really, really tough and challenging. And in terms of like, yeah, how that relates to like Great Lakes protection, well, it's just reflective of this government has not a good track record when it comes to the environment since they came into office and since they've been reelected. And who knows, like when they might try and pull that notwithstanding clause out again to do something. But the government, the way that the government's acting with like, you know, Bill 23 and opening up the greenbelt and using that notwithstanding clause, like I kind of, to me, it's like the government currently thinks it's a bit invincible. And can essentially, it is, we live in a democracy, but that's not democratic, that's dictating, right? So I don't know, it's a sad time for democracy and yeah, trying to environmental protections right now in Toronto. And whoever said we live in a corporatocracy, that is, yeah, I think that's the thing too, is like corporations yield so much power, and the line 5 is an example of it. The amount of power that Enbridge yields over the Canadian government, because Enbridge has been like a backbone of energy in Canada for so long. And I can walk down my street and see their logo on like a pole because of the natural gas pipelines running through the area. And so that's, yeah. And what's happening with Ford and all of his moves in terms of like opening up the greenbelt to developers, again, that's like, it's other form of like corporations having so much power.
There was
Something-
another
Oh,
comment,
sorry, go
I
ahead,
think,
Deb.
on the Sustainable Development Goals. Did you see that one,
Oh, yeah.
Michelle?
That was a good one. Just about if the SDGs could help. So Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 goals by the UN to create a more sustainable like globe. Not to mansplain or anything, but how could those be incorporated into Great Lakes water protection? And could that help overall?
I think theoretically it should, but they're so high level. You have to start figuring out how to make it a reality at the moment. Like in the university, they say, we're always asked this question, how does your research contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals? Because I think big publicly funded institutions somehow have to account for it because Canada signs on to these. But it's more the afterthought. It's not like you design everything around a Sustainable Development Goals. It's like you do your thing and it's like, oh, okay, I think it might fit in number 16 or whatever else. So it's not part of how people just think about things, which is, I think, what the intention is supposed to be. The other thing I'll say about it is, I think you also need to reorient what we even mean by sustainable development, because the idea is that fundamentally we just keep taking sustainably over time, which is a very bizarre philosophy. One thing I learned from Anishinaabe elder, actually from out Treaty 3 area, the late Robin Green, was, from an Anishinaabe perspective, we don't think about what we can keep taking, you think about what you're gonna give to the earth. It's a completely different way of thinking about that. Sustainable Development Goals don't have that thinking. It's more, how do you sustainably keep taking fundamentally, as opposed to, we don't think about what decisions can we make that's going to help the natural world or the earth or future generations flourish. It's more, how can they still have the very over-consumptive life that we have for into the future? So it's a very, underneath it is kind of flawed thinking, but I'm not saying they're bad. But again, that's been my experience with them. It's sort of an afterthought. Oh, does that relate to one of the Sustainable Development Goals? And then you look at them and you're like, oh, yeah, maybe this one. It's not ingrained in how people think at the moment. So theoretically it should, but right now I don't think it's influencing too much thinking around the Great Lakes that I'm aware of, maybe. But again, it's probably all theory and rhetoric and not on the ground yet.
Michelle, do you have anything to add for that one? No, I was just thinking about like in all, Canada ratifies these agreements. These are like international treaties, but really they don't have like, they're not legal ideologies. They're like international law. There's no like, it's like, oh, we'll think about that. Oh, sure. We'll think about that. Like the United Nations Declaration of for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's like, oh, that's a good consideration. Maybe we'll think about that one day. But yeah, so really, like, of course, incorporating all of this into every single business structure that's happening around the Great Lakes, I think would really help to promote Great Lakes water health. The same with like, fertilizers and pesticides and so forth. If every single person around the Great Lakes who utilizes the Great Lakes for whatever purpose thought about these things, I think that of course we would have a more sustainable like ecosystem, right? I wanted to, I guess, come to a close. It's 7:55. Firstly, I want to thank both of you for being here this evening. It's so meaningful to Water Allies, and thank you, Michelle, and the Partnership with Environmental Defense. This has been just fantastic. And Melanie from Water Docs sends a heart. And Deborah, thank you so much. You always added perspective because of your lifelong commitment to work in water justice, to work with Indigenous rights. I learned so much from you every single time I get the opportunity to be in your presence. And so I just wanted to thank both of you, to everyone out there. Thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for listening. And I hope that we've all gained a little bit more. Maybe we've become better people in this one evening session.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michelle, and learn a lot from you as well. And
Yes, thank you. Miigwech. Kichi miigwech to everyone.
Good night.
bye.
Thank you.
Bye.